A gloomy morning on the outskirts of Oregon. The day began with an almost cinematic dreariness. The sky was clouded over, a pale gray that seemed to swallow every ray of sunlight before it could reach the quiet earth. Dew clung heavily to the wild grass by the roadside, blurring the crisp lines between field and highway. It was the sort of morning where your breath fogs the window, and the sound of a lone car engine echoes just a little longer than usual. I've always believed that certain places carry their own moods. Out here in the rural fringes south of Salem, Oregon, the air itself felt weighed down by some invisible presence. Early risers, farmers in mud-splattered boots, truckers hauling out before sunrise, the odd jogger braving the chilled air, moved through this world half-muted as if waiting for something to break the stillness. Oregon's Willamette Valley is picturesque in an understated, brooding way. Rolling hills stretch endlessly, dotted with sturdy old barns and windbreaks of fir trees. Rows upon rows of blueberry bushes and hazelnut orchards trace the curves of the earth. But there's another side to the region, one that doesn't appear on postcards or produce labels. It's in the run-down trailers tucked behind thickets of blackberry and in the shuttered windows of forgotten general stores, where the echoes of economic hardship rattle like loose panes of glass. On this particular Tuesday in 2022, the world seemed to be holding its breath. I'd always felt safe here growing up, comforted by the slow rhythms of rural life. People valued their privacy, but they also looked out for each other, in their own way. It was a place where gossip traveled fast in the general store, but secrets, when serious enough, could be buried deep for years. That morning, the peace was shattered by the distant wail of sirens, quickly swallowed by the dense stands of conifers. I looked up from my kitchen window, and saw a pair of police cruisers speeding down the lane that led to the old Miller property, the biggest hog farm for miles. The Miller place was infamous for reasons both mundane and mysterious. An old lady hermit occasionally glimpsed at the mailbox, rumors of wild parties drifting from the barns, and whispers that the owner preferred pigs to people. The road leading to the Miller farm curved through misty lowlands and under sagging power lines, the gravel always crunching under the wheels. By the time the police stopped at the battered wooden gate, the few neighbors close enough to notice were already peering through parted curtains. Nothing this interesting had happened here in a long time. You could sense an unspoken tension in the air. Out in these parts, nobody was a stranger for long, and every odd occurrence got logged in the collective memory. The land itself, generous and punishing in equal measure, seemed to know that something was about to change. A premonition twined into the fog, the crows startled from a cedar fence. I had no idea then how the events that would unfold on that gray Oregon morning would come to haunt the entire region, or just how much of the darkness lurking on the edge of our small community was about to be brought, dragging and wailing, into the clear light of day. The initial discovery, firearms and unsettling clues. The phone call that set everything in motion on that bleak Tuesday was, at first, little more than a routine headache for the Marion County Sheriff's Office. A neighbor, stressed by weeks of odd activity and the silent traffic in and out of the Miller hog farm, quietly tipped off the authorities about a stash of unregistered firearms supposedly stored on the premises. In Oregon, firearms are a fact of life, but unregistered or modified weapons are a serious legal line, especially when previous rumors have swirled around a property's reclusive owner. Detectives moved swiftly, drafting affidavits, assembling a warrant team, and coordinating with the local ATF office to ensure all legal T's were crossed. The morning air felt even heavier as a pair of stark white squad cars rolled down the rutted lane flanked by towering Douglas firs and the broken-down mailboxes of rural households. Despite the miles of open field and the distance from Salem's urban grind, everyone on the force knew that out here, nothing really stayed secret for long. When Deputy Angela Ruiz and Detective Hal Patterson were led onto the property by the Millers' weary housekeeper, a knot of keys trembling in her wrinkled fist, they braced themselves for the predictable, a couple of hunting rifles perhaps, or a forgotten handgun left in a barn. What they found was altogether more disturbing. Through the mud-caked corridors of the livestock yard and past the sweltering heat of the slaughterhouse, the investigators moved methodically. In an ancient travel trailer, its aluminum siding patched with duct tape and motley stickers, they pried open an old trunk. Inside, among musty blankets and tools, were not just standard hunting weapons, but a small arsenal. Military-grade rifles, several unlicensed handguns with filed-off serial numbers, and boxes upon boxes of ammunition neatly labeled by caliber. The serial numbers, or lack thereof, immediately raised suspicions that these guns had been purchased, or stolen, off the grid. Some weapons were clearly illegal under both state and federal statutes. But it wasn't just the guns. What struck the officers was the strange detritus scattered across the tiny, cramped space. Articles of women's clothing, far too many, in too wide a variety of styles and sizes to belong to one woman, hung from rusty hooks and were jammed into plastic tubs beneath the makeshift bed. Glinting between a worn hunting jacket and muddy work boots was a tangled bracelet, a high-heeled shoe spattered with what looked unsettlingly like dried blood. Detective Patterson exchanged an uneasy glance with Ruiz. They'd both seen their share of domestic squabbles and minor crimes, but this was something different, layered and raw. On the countertop, amid cigarette burns and yellowed coupons, lay something that shouldn't have been there at all. A blue asthma inhaler, labeled with a name neither officer recognized. Ruiz, whose own child suffered from asthma, immediately bagged it for evidence. They would later discover that this inhaler would be central in connecting the Miller property and its secretive owner to something far more sinister than the hoarding of weapons, the case of a missing young woman from Salem, last seen weeks prior. With each object the officers cataloged, dangling earrings, mascara tubes, soiled scarves, a cheap flip phone frozen on a home screen photo of two laughing girls, the atmosphere inside the trailer grew heavier, charged with unspoken dread. The air seemed to thicken with the realization that despite the rural quiet, something deeply wrong had been festering here for much longer than anyone had guessed. The officers finished their initial search with grim faces, and a sense that the usual paperwork this time would be just the beginning. The start of a chilling series of discoveries. The moment the police began their methodical search of the Miller property, a sense of unease took root and grew with every step. The farm, sprawling across acre after acre of dense Oregon countryside, was a labyrinth of mud-splattered outbuildings, tangled fencing, and the faint but persistent odor of live pigs and bleach. Every corner seemed to promise either the mundane or something that might haunt the imagination. Although Lester Miller, the farm's infamous owner, was absent, his aging housekeeper, worn down by decades of hard rural living, watched the search with wary sunken eyes. Guided by the woman's trembling hands, deputies split up, flashlights beaming over hay-strewn floors, rusted farm equipment, and the maze-like paddocks. At first the officers' findings were ordinary enough, bags of feed, piles of scrap metal, buckets of tools. But then, beneath a broken floor panel in the main barn, a rookie officer's flashlight caught on the surprising glint of metal. Hidden in the shadows was a cleverly disguised trunk, a relic from the 1970s, battered on the outside but heavy and secure. Inside, as they pried the lock loose, the officers uncovered yet another cache of firearms, larger, more varied, and more carelessly stored than the first. But firearms weren't the only things stored here. A jumble of women's handbags, costume jewelry, and faded scarves spilled out, some spotted with what bore a dark, incriminating rust red. Each new object seemed to tell its own fragmented story of fear, abrupt endings, and lost identity. Mixed with muddy coveralls and work gloves were high-heeled shoes in different sizes, perfume bottles long drained, and personal papers including driver's licenses, lipstick-stained napkins, notes scribbled in hurried handwriting, none belonging to anyone known to the Miller household. The disturbing pattern quickened the deputies' pulse and sharpened their focus. Something far more tragic than illegal gun storage had taken place on this farm. The search moved outside. In the shadow of a sagging wood fence by the slaughter shed, detectives unearthed a blood-soaked blanket wrapped tightly around yet another mystery. When the forensics team arrived later that day, blood spatter patterns and latent prints sent a grim message. The violence on this farm hadn't merely been accidental or isolated, it was systematic, hidden, and sustained. What turned the routine investigation into a full-blown nightmare was the discovery of a set of handcuffs, burned at one end, and stamped with a serial number later traced to missing evidence from a domestic violence case in Salem. Close by, a slashed and half-buried purse revealed IDs for more than one missing woman. From that moment, protocol shifted. Crime scene tape cordoned off the outbuildings, searchers in white suits fanned out across fields and under decades-old debris, each expecting that what they were about to find might shatter the town's fragile calm forever. For everyone on site, the feeling was clear. The Miller farm was no longer just an isolated oddity, It was the front line of a mystery that would unravel the community's sense of safety, dragging hidden horrors out into the pale and unforgiving daylight. Clues from an asthma medication bottle and unusual DNA. As the evidence lab whirred late into the night, boxes of tagged items flooded in from the Miller farm. Among them, the blue asthma inhaler pulled from the cluttered countertop stood out. It was an oddity, even in a hall of odd things, a lifeline for someone. But its label was half-faded, the name barely legible. When Detective Ruiz dropped it off with the lead forensics tech, she couldn't shake the thought, somewhere, a girl was missing her inhaler, or worse, she'd never have a chance to use it again. DNA analysis is never as cinematic as forensic dramas on TV. In reality, it means endless paperwork, chain of custody forms, and late nights in the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. But on that particular Friday, the techs ran a rapid swab across the rubber mouthpiece. The result, when it came back, sliced through the routine. 2 distinct DNA profiles. One unmistakably belonged to a young woman recently listed as missing in Salem, and the other, inconclusive but human, possibly from the suspect himself. When the match hit the state database, it confirmed everyone's worst fear. The missing woman, Sarah Nguyen, had been last seen near downtown Salem 3 weeks prior, her sudden disappearance leaving family and outreach workers frantic but until now, nearly invisible to the greater public. That her DNA was on an object hidden among so much chaos on the Miller property finally tied the case to something solid and chilling. Detectives quickly realized the significance. The inhaler wasn't just a medical device, it was a marker, a silent witness. Detailed interviews with Sarah's family revealed she never went anywhere without it due to severe asthma. If Sarah's inhaler was on the farm but Sarah wasn't, what had happened to her in those shadowy corners? The implications pressed hard on the investigation. The inhaler, now preserved in a clear evidence bag and photographed from every angle, was sent for further touch DNA analysis and fingerprint work. Meanwhile, detectives started combing through missing persons reports looking for other potential links, other women who may have vanished without a trace, their lives intersecting, perhaps fatally, with the Miller place. For the first time, every member of the team felt an inescapable chill. The case had shifted from an unsettling weapons bust to a probable homicide with a living, breathing face. And with every hour that passed, Miller's secrets seemed more jagged, more dangerous, and more likely to drag other names out of the shadows. The stark tragedy of the nameless lives. While the evidence mounted in sterile evidence bags and harsh fluorescent light, a deeper sorrow began to permeate every brief the detectives read, and every corner of the Miller farm they searched. Underneath the official process, the gloves, the camera flashes, the police tape, were stories too often overlooked, stories with no one left to tell them. In the chaos of the investigation, a stack of women's clothing, battered handbags, and fragmented personal effects started to form a silent testament to lives lived invisibly and ended violently. The community's initial shock at the grisly discoveries soon hardened into something heavier, the sorrow of realizing so many victims had slipped through the cracks. These women, like so many in rural and struggling areas of Oregon, had lived on society's margins, long seen but rarely noticed. Many were believed to have been transient, women drifting through homeless shelters, working odd jobs, or trading comfort for drugs or protection. They left few paper trails and, heartbreakingly, not many people to report when they disappeared. Each item, lipstick-stained napkins, half-torn photos, a child's backpack, hinted at stories cut short, relationships frayed, hopes quietly abandoned for survival. As more evidence trickled in, some identities began to emerge, their faces frozen in time on old driver's licenses or the flicker of a graduation picture. Yet for every woman police identified, there were more who remained forever nameless. No one waiting for answers, no relatives to haunt the local stations with missing person flyers. Their physical remains had been found, but the world had moved on long before Miller ever crossed their paths. Detectives, hardened by years of grisly work, found themselves lingering on these artifacts just a little longer and sitting a little heavier with their coffee after overnight shifts. The tragedy reshaped the narrative of the entire investigation. Local news began to shift from lurid headlines to profiles and features on the unseen women of Marion County, gradually piecing together a mosaic of hardship, resilience, and vulnerability that had all too often ended in silence. Community advocates who had been dismissed as alarmists in the past were now invited to join meetings with the sheriff's office and victim support organizations. Candlelight vigils sprung up on rural church lawns, each new shoe, scarf, or photograph fueling a communal sense of grief. For the survivors, women who had escaped, sometimes barely, the fate of those found at the Miller farm, the case became a touchstone for speaking up. They told reporters, social workers, and detectives about the patterns they'd seen. The men who offered rides that felt too good to be true, the wordless disappearances, the dangers that lurked where no one was looking. Their stories, once easily dismissed, now shimmered with an urgency and pain that the entire county could not ignore. By the end of that long week, the Miller case was no longer just about illegal weapons or even murder. It had become a glaring indictment of how easily certain lives are erased when a community, by ignorance or design, chooses not to see them. The artifacts left behind, rusty jewelry, torn sweatshirts, a faded birthday card, became haunting, stubborn reminders that behind every headline was a tragedy that had once been a human being. Shocking dissection and the first skeletal remains. The arrival of the state forensic team signaled a significant escalation in both the intensity and the horror of the investigation. The Miller farm, once just an unsettling rumor on the rural grapevine, abruptly transformed into the focus of a sprawling crime scene. Word had spread, and by midday the entire property was encircled by yellow tape, law enforcement vehicles, and the quiet, watchful eyes of news crews camped out by the lane. The decision to dig around the battered travel trailer did not come lightly. Initial sweeps with cadaver dogs had yielded subtle but unmistakable alerts, cautiously wagging tails freezing into stiff postures in certain muddy corners, noses pressed intently to the damp soil. It was here that the lead forensic anthropologist, Dr. Cecilia Grant, made her base of operations. Dr. Grant, a stoic woman with a crisp voice honed by years spent testifying in courtrooms, led her team with methodical precision. Every piece of earth displaced was carefully sifted and each find meticulously logged by gloved hands and camera flashes. Minutes stretched into hours as the forensic crew dug, first with shovels, then with smaller, more precise trowels and brushes. Layer by layer, the secrets of the Miller property began to emerge. The first discovery was a shock, a bundle of disintegrating fabric, mottled with the rusty brown stain of expired life, wrapped tightly around what was chillingly recognizable as human bone. The femur had been hacked crudely, likely by a tool common to both farming and slaughter, the cleaver. Nearby, entangled in roots and caked in dirt, fragments of jewelry glimmered, a bent silver necklace, a charm engraved with initials, the remnants of a plastic comb. The digging widened, and soon the grim pattern repeated itself. In all, 4 distinct sets of remains were found within a 70-meter radius, each one telling its own silent story of violence and despair. 2 bodies had been reduced almost entirely to skeletal fragments, their teeth later used for preliminary identification by comparing dental records. Another, less decomposed, bore the sickening marks of both sharp trauma, indicative of deep lethal cuts, and blunt force injury consistent with blows from a heavy farm implement. What set the scene apart for Dr. Grant and the detectives assigned was just how methodical the concealment appeared to be. The earth had been turned with a disturbing neatness, debris and animal offal layered above and around the remains to mask both sight and scent. One of the bodies, wrapped in a blood-stained farm tarp, had heavy cinder blocks positioned on top to discourage curious wildlife from disturbing the site, a macabre attempt at invisibility. Shreds of industrial plastic, wired shut, served as unknowing burial shrouds. Over the next days, the field was transformed into a patchwork of forensic tents and floodlights as the methodical search continued. The drought-dried ground, hardened by decades of neglect, and the trampling hooves of livestock, made progress excruciatingly slow. Every bone fragment, every scrap of clothing was bagged, tagged, and sent with painstaking detail to the forensic pathologist's van for on-site assessment before eventual transfer to the county coroner's office. In the stifling confines of one such tent, Dr. Grant and her team faced their most sobering task yet, piecing together physical trauma and personal histories from the damage left behind. The brutal efficiency of the injuries startled even the most seasoned crime scene technicians. Some victims had been dispatched with orchestrated violence, blows that mirrored slaughterhouse techniques. Precise, mechanical, almost practiced. A chilling parallel emerged between the way livestock was handled on the farm and the treatment of these lost women, violent stripped of emotion, routine in its cruelty. Forensic evidence went beyond the merely physical. In the soil clinging to the dead, investigators found strands of hair, fingernails, even shreds of synthetic fiber that would eventually link certain remains to the objects found in the trailer, scarves, earrings, a stained purse. Toxicology screens would later show chemicals common in sedatives, suggesting some victims had been drugged before the end. In one case, a plastic hospital bracelet, still faintly legible, eventually identified a victim last seen at the Salem ER. Each cross-reference between discovered evidence and missing persons reports tied the Miller property more tightly to Salem's string of disappearances. Through it all, the air grew heavier, the mood in the tents darkening with every new recovery bag. Deputies, some veterans, some rookies, found themselves stepping out into the cold Oregon dawns to steel their nerves, exchanging few words but haunted by the enormity of the task before them. For many, this was their first exposure to the sheer scope of human cruelty, hidden under the veneer of rural tranquility. Chaplains and trauma counselors were called in for the first time in department history, maps on makeshift war room walls filled with colored pins marking each find, lines and connections gradually sketching an expanding picture of the horror that had played out over years, maybe decades, in the Miller killing grounds. The local media dubbed it the anatomy of secrecy. To detectives, it was a searing lesson in not taking any rural rumor for granted, no matter how outlandish. By the end of the sixth day, the official tally of discovered remains had quadrupled initial expectations. Coroners, medical examiners, and FBI consultants pored over burned diaries, disintegrating Polaroids, and scraps of correspondence, desperate to snatch identities and narratives from the jaws of oblivion. Each new name recovered brought fresh waves of grief to families who had clung to hope. Each unidentified set of bones brought a new, aching question: who else and how many remained buried here, or had simply vanished into the lonely quiet of the environs? The Miller farm, standing ghost-like in the early morning fog, ceased to be just another grim statistic. It became a symbol, a warning, to every tight-knit community that evil can flourish wherever denial, poverty, and secrecy meet. The fieldwork on those grounds would continue for weeks, but even in those first shocking days, everyone involved knew nothing in Marion County would be quite the same again. A mysterious confession in prison. The arrest of Lester Miller sent shockwaves not only through the rural community, but deep into the inner workings of law enforcement and the media. He was booked late in the evening, after a methodical and tense search of both his person and property, surrounded by a cadre of silent deputies and grim-faced detectives. At the station, under flickering fluorescent lights, Miller appeared to retreat inward, his face betraying nothing, except a kind of practiced, cold composure. Anyone expecting a dramatic outburst or a tearful breakdown was left disappointed. He asked for his lawyer, and for the next few days, communicated in clipped sentences, never offering more than the minimum to his interrogators. The detectives assigned to question Miller had seen every trick in the book, the deflections, the false bravado, the cold stonewalling. They rotated through the interview room, each approaching Miller with a different tactic: sympathy, anger, silence, logic. All met the same brick wall. Miller admitted only to what had already been found: the illegal firearms and an ambiguous acknowledgement that he was a private man who ran a tough business. He consistently denied any knowledge of missing women or the mountains of personal effects discovered in the trailer and around the property. As the legal system began to grind forward, warrants, arraignment, and the press conferences, the case seemed at risk of stalling. There was enormous evidence, but much of it was still circumstantial, and Miller's skill at dodging direct answers left gaps that could open up in court. Detectives and prosecutors understood that a confession, or at the very least some incriminating statements, could make or break the case, especially given the high-profile attention and public scrutiny now aimed at the department. It was Detective Supervisor Lena Vaughn who suggested a different approach. Miller had been placed temporarily in the Marion County Jail, awaiting transfer to a larger facility. Vaughn proposed carefully planting an undercover detective into Miller's cell block, someone new to the region with a plausible backstory, who could slip into Miller's world without rousing suspicion. The team selected Officer Ray Moreno, whose unassuming manner and farm-town accent made him a natural fit for the cover story, a drifter with a string of minor assault charges looking to trade information for a lightened sentence. Moreno spent 2 days acclimating to the routines of the jail. He ate at the same battered metal tables, endured the same endless noise and the daily monotony, and shared stories with the other inmates. He made casual mention of his own supposed troubles, couching them in the language of hard living and dubious loyalties. When he was finally introduced to Miller as a cellmate, he played it cool, letting the older man set the pace. At first, Miller was quiet, reading mostly, sometimes lifting his head just long enough to nod. but the rhythm and ritual of the cell block slowly did its work. Over midnight card games and whispered conversations, Moreno began to gently prod at the edges of Miller's silence. He spoke about life on the road, the temptation to cut a few corners, the times when life demanded sharp, uncompromising action. Every story was bait, laid carefully in the hope of drawing Miller out without raising his suspicions. It took time. Miller was nothing if not cautious. A lifetime of solitude and secrets had made him almost pathologically careful. But jail has a way of wearing down even the hardest men. There are only so many books, so much solitary pacing before the human desire for connection or recognition slips through the cracks. What started as vague, mutual complaints about the unfairness of law enforcement and the softness of the outside world slowly edged into more personal territory. Miller spoke bitterly of people who had tried to take advantage of him, of women who, in his words, learned too late that life on the farm was about survival, not comfort. All the while, Moreno carefully reported back every conversation to the detectives, and every moment in the cell was recorded with tiny, concealed surveillance. The dam finally broke late one rain-soaked evening, after the cell doors had clanged shut for lights out. Moreno mentioned people from his own past, ghosts he hinted he'd left behind, and the necessity sometimes of making sure loose ends stayed buried. Miller's voice was low, a rasp in the dark. "You do what you have to," he said. He confessed to having helped a few people vanish when they became a problem on his property. Sensing the shift, Moreno gently pressed forward, saying how hard it was to keep up the act when locals start poking around. Miller, his tone almost boastful now, outlined in veiled but unmistakable detail how he selected women from Salem's poorer districts, offering them cash and shelter, then luring them to his property. Sometimes they worked, sometimes he implied they didn't leave. In chilling fragments, Miller described clearing out the trouble and how nobody comes looking for girls like that. These words, captured on hidden microphones, resonated with the already mounting evidence. The next morning, authorities reviewed hours of grainy audio. Prosecutors listened as Miller, drawn in by the illusion of mutual understanding, confessed in enough specifics to tie him directly to the disappearances. There was finally a bridge between the recovered physical evidence and Miller's own words, a dark roadmap matched by witness statements and forensic results. Still, no confession erases tragedy. When the news broke that Miller had essentially detailed his crimes behind bars, the public's fascination turned to disgust and mourning. The women Miller spoke of so thoughtlessly became more than case numbers or headlines. They were given at last the dignity of being missed, and their absence became an indictment of every system and person who had ignored their cries for help. In that cell, Miller had unburdened himself in the dark, never knowing his words would bring a reckoning long overdue. The dark side of American society, exposed. The darkness that seemed to hang over the Miller farm was never merely a matter of personal evil, or the isolated acts of a single predator. As the investigation pushed deeper, it became clear that the horror was not created in a vacuum, but rather had been shaped and concealed by far-reaching shadows woven throughout American society. Shadows that enveloped far more than the rural outskirts of Salem, Oregon. Miller's case tore open old wounds and forced both authorities and the public to confront harsh truths about poverty, marginalization, and the ways in which whole segments of the population slipped through the cracks. For decades, rural Oregon had lived with the dual realities of breathtaking natural beauty and deepening social malaise. Over the last 30 years, unemployment rates had quietly soared as family-owned farms shut down, manufacturing jobs fled overseas, and an opioid crisis swept through like wildfire. The result was a fraying community fabric, higher rates of addiction, mental illness, and homelessness, all against a backdrop of small-town stoicism and a tradition of handling one's problems in silence. Against this landscape, the most vulnerable, especially women with unstable housing or histories of trauma, became invisible. They drifted through the system, cycling between shelters, low-wage jobs, or all too often the streets, seldom attracting the attention of anyone with the power or resources to help them. The Miller murders exposed the profound dangers of this invisibility. As detectives pored over missing persons reports, they found that many of the women who had vanished in the region were never fully reported by family, and those who were often went unsearched for by local law enforcement. Names accumulated in case files, sometimes marked only by incomplete descriptions or out-of-date ID photos. Systemic failures were everywhere. Overworked police departments with limited funding, a social safety net eroded by budget cuts, and not least, a pervasive sense of resignation within the community itself. She was probably just moving on, people would say about those who disappeared, never imagining they might have met a much darker fate. Public reaction to the Miller case was a complex storm of horror, shame, and outrage. The story hit national headlines, and in the aftermath, journalists from major outlets descended on Marion County, eager to dig up the truth behind years of vanished women. News programs ran segments on the vanishing poor, and local advocates seized the moment to speak out. Candlelight vigils were organized in both Salem and neighboring towns. For the first time, politicians felt compelled to listen to grassroots organizations serving at-risk populations, battered women's centers, addiction recovery groups, immigrant support networks. The Miller case forced conversations that had long been dismissed as too difficult, too costly, or, at worst, irrelevant to the lives of average voters. It wasn't just the poverty and lack of resources that came under scrutiny. The social stigma attached to sex work, homelessness, and addiction had for years protected people like Miller from invasive inquiry. Victims who survived his farm or escaped similar predicaments often faced disbelief or outright hostility when they sought help from authorities. Many recounted being laughed out of police stations, or accused of inventing stories to cover for their own choices. Their poverty marked them as unreliable witnesses even as they tried desperately to warn others. Cases were dismissed, dangers ignored, and, in the end, the killers that preyed upon these margins could do so for years without interference. It was in this context that the Miller story became more than just a grisly spectacle. Activists and legal experts turned it into a rallying cry for reforms. Panels were convened by state lawmakers to re-examine unsolved disappearances from the last 2 decades. Civil rights attorneys called for audits of law enforcement agencies, focusing on how resources were allocated and the inherent bias faced by victims considered undesirable. Reports surfaced of women who had reported abuse or gone missing before, only to have their pleas filed and forgotten. Miller's trial turned into a public inquest on institutional neglect and the failed promises of justice. For communities across America, the painful revelations echoed beyond Oregon. In every city or county with similar economic despair and cultural indifference, people recognized the threads of their own local tragedies woven through the Miller affair. Lawmakers, social workers, and faith leaders used the media frenzy as an opportunity to push for better funding of shelters, improved mental health services, and renewed prosecutorial focus on violence against women, especially those who lacked the support systems that wealthier, more visible citizens could rely on. Most of all, the Miller case provided painful evidence that monsters are not always lurking in the shadows by themselves. Far too often they are enabled by collective silence, denial, and the convenience of looking away. The cost of this negligence is carved into the missing persons flyers taped to gas station windows and the trauma etched onto the faces of survivors. Many of the rescued women, newly emboldened, gave heart-wrenching interviews. Some recounted how it felt to have no one believe them. Others described the shame of returning to their communities only to be shunned for their past. One speaker, herself a survivor of the region's sex trafficking network, demanded that the names and stories of the lost be written down, remembered, and never swept under the rug again. Under pressure, the police departments in the Willamette Valley signed cooperation agreements with social service agencies. County commissioners authorized mobile outreach teams tasked with finding and supporting young women at risk, staffing these teams with people who had lived through similar hardships. New codings were added to missing person databases, ensuring that cases involving vulnerable adults or transient individuals received the same attention as others. State grants funded educational campaigns in schools, teaching teenagers how to recognize grooming, trafficking, and signs of predatory manipulation. Across Oregon, it became harder to pretend that these crimes were merely the aberrant acts of a lone killer. Still, progress was slow and pain stubbornly persistent. For every measure adopted, resistance bubbled up in the form of political fatigue, budgetary constraints, and outright bigotry toward the communities most affected. Comment sections filled with blame for the victims. Why were these women at that farm in the first place? Others twisted their anger toward law enforcement or social workers, unable or unwilling to accept the breadth of the failure. In Salem, some neighbors spoke in whispers about the shame of being known as the town where it all happened, worried for their property values and reputations. Those who fought the hardest to draw attention to the case found themselves threatened or ostracized. The Miller case illuminated an uncomfortable reality. True progress would require ongoing vigilance, honest reckoning, and a willingness to see every person, regardless of their past or poverty, as worthy of dignity and protection. In every hearing, every vigil, and every call to action, the truth rang out. When the least visible among us are left unprotected, the darkness is not only on the edge of town, it festers, grows, and sooner or later erupts into the collective daylight, demanding that we look and act and remember. As the seasons changed and the headlines faded, the legacy of the Miller investigation lingered as both warning and mandate. The scars it left in Marion County became a rallying point, not just a memorial for those lost, but a challenge to every community to confront the shadows within their own borders before another tragedy could take root. The facade of charity and the dark revelry. During the years when property values began to rise and the surrounding farmland found itself creeping toward gentrification, Lester Miller saw an opportunity not only to line his pockets, but also to cast himself in a new, more respectable light. It was around this time that Miller, often joined by his slick-talking, opportunistic younger brother, concocted the idea of hosting supposedly charitable events at the expansive, derelict farm. Flyers went up in local bars and corner stores, advertising community fundraisers, functions intended, at least on paper, to raise money for everything from battered women's shelters to youth education programs. Tickets were sold with the promise of live bands, pit-roasted pork, raffles, and the open-armed hospitality for which rural Oregon was quietly known. Behind these glossy promises, however, the reality was far starker. The so-called charity galas quickly evolved into notorious affairs, magnets for all walks of society's strays. Farmers in mud-streaked Carhartts rubbed elbows with bikers from out-of-state ex-cons and hard-edged men and women loosely affiliated with various criminal outfits that laid claim to the region's backroads and truck stops. The parties lasted until dawn, fueled by whiskey distilled in backsheds, clouds of cheap marijuana, and a brash, lawless energy that simmered just beneath the surface. The Miller brothers, ever the gracious hosts, poured drinks and slapped backs, weaving through the gathering with fake smiles and matching boots caked in dirt. For many attendees, these nights were rowdy but ostensibly harmless, a break from the monotony and hardship of rural life. There was music, dancing, sometimes a fistfight, but Avery, the local deputy, would later admit that everybody figured it was just country folks blowing off steam. Yet those who lingered after the main crowd had left spoke in low voices about a sense of menace that crept in with the early morning fog. More than one woman reported feeling a cold, appraising gaze from Lester Miller as he watched the interactions, laughing too loudly at off-color jokes and brushing off odd disappearances with a shrug and another swig of bourbon. The dark truth was that the charity events, often filmed or photographed for local news as proof of Miller's good works, served a dual purpose. They functioned as hunting grounds. Amid the chaos, Miller could hand-pick prospective victims, women who seemed vulnerable, strung out, short on cash, or simply adrift from their social moorings. In the blinding glow of bonfires or under the blinking Christmas lights hung over the barn rafters, invitations for after-parties or side gigs were whispered to those he deemed desperate enough to take the bait. Miller was careful, never too forward, always letting his brother or an associate do the inviting. He knew which doors to open and how to hide his intentions behind a practiced grin. Charity was the mask. Darkness was the engine. Almost every party ended with one or two women vanishing into the maze of outbuildings with a member of Miller's inner circle, only for their friends to be told, the next day, that they'd hopped a ride to Portland or decided to take off for good. Those who asked questions were met with vague threats or icy indifference. A bartender from town who once pressed Miller about a missing guest found his tire slashed the next night. Whispers spread among the county's itinerant population. The prize for getting too close to the Millers wasn't money or good times, but trouble. These predatory undertones didn't just slip past the authorities, they were actively covered up. Miller and his brother made regular donations to the local sheriff's re-election campaign and volunteered, at least symbolically, in a handful of civic initiatives. When city council members or journalists asked about the rumors, they'd be greeted with an open farm gate and a photo op with a rescued puppy. Local newsprint ran stories about Lester Miller's charitable giving, all while women continued to vanish in patterns just subtle enough to avoid statistical suspicion. The bashes changed over the years, growing more raucous and selective, even as public suspicion began to stir. Certain elements, especially out-of-town bikers and associates from the neighboring county's darker corners, gained prominence as regular guests. Drugs began to circulate with alarming regularity, stashes ferried through hidden service doors or slipped into the pockets of those Miller silently approved. It wasn't just a case of the odd missing woman anymore, it was a locus of criminal traffic, a place where illicit deals and dangerous secrets passed hands over the remnants of barbecue and cheap beer. Occasionally a neighbor would raise an alarm after seeing suspicious activity, women staggering or crying in the pre-dawn hours, cars leaving at reckless speeds, loud arguments cutting through the usual nighttime quiet. But complaints were deflected, first by Miller's brother's ingratiating apologies, and later by outright intimidation from the rougher elements attending the parties. As time wore on, fewer outsiders dared set foot on Miller's property, except those truly without options. Some survivors later recounted surreal memories, being plied with drinks until they lost hours of time, waking up in strange rooms in the farmhouse, or on one unforgettable occasion locked in a livestock trailer. Others remembered the sound of pigs rooting in the dark, their cries drowned out by the distant, raucous laughter of partygoers. One woman, whose story eventually helped break the investigation open, recalled Miller sitting quietly in a kitchen full of revelers, his eyes fixed not on the dancing or the drunken joy, but on the shadowed corners of the room where the most desperate drifted. As investigators later pieced together, the charity galas were not only a mask, but the linchpin in a broader apparatus of exploitation. Miller's parties cultivated a loyal, frightened silence among guests and neighbors alike. Nobody wanted to cross the brothers and their increasingly dangerous company, and with charitable donations as cover, the Millers built a reputation for generosity that few dared openly challenge. The duality at play, the blaring music, the communal plates of food, the tightly controlled invitations to a select few, became symbolic of the darkness hidden within outward virtue. When the truth came to light, the photos of Miller and his brother grinning with civic leaders or cradling symbolic donation checks took on an unthinkably twisted hue. Those outward gestures, meant to inspire faith and trust, seemed like mocking tributes to the real work being done in the shadows. A constant search for the weakest link, the next woman with nowhere else to turn, and the next moment when public eyes would be diverted by the appearance of good works. A rare brush with death. Wendy's story is not just a testament to survival, but an uneasy window into the razor's edge that separated life from anonymous tragedy for countless women in the shadows of Marion County. Years before Lester Miller's empire of secrecy collapsed under the weight of damning evidence, Wendy slipped unexpectedly into his orbit. Her account would later haunt investigators, an unsettling reminder that evil rarely hides in fairy tale monsters, but rather in the disguised faces of neighbors and local celebrities. A cascade of bad luck, lost jobs and addiction had reduced Wendy to drifting through the lesser-lit streets of Salem's industrial fringes. The winter she met Miller was especially harsh, her days punctuated by empty stomachs, icy benches, and run-ins with men who measured kindness with calculating eyes. When Miller first stopped to offer her a ride, he projected the casual, earthy charm of someone used to taking control. Wendy, weathered by caution but desperate for warmth and a hot meal, accepted. She knew well the peril latent in the charity of strangers, yet the hunger, cold, and exhaustion shifted boundaries in ways she sometimes hated to admit. At first, Miller was almost disarmingly polite. He bought her coffee, pressed a $20 into her hand, and listened with what seemed genuine interest to her meandering story. He spoke about odd jobs, a place to stay, clean work in the country, away from the relentless grind of the street. To a woman living hour by hour, the pitch was familiar, a lottery ticket with poor odds, but odds nonetheless. By nightfall, Wendy found herself bumping along the rural gravel lane leading to the Miller farm, nerves taut but hopes flickering. That night, the barn-turned dormitory did not resemble any shelter she'd known. No other women. Just Miller, his brother lingering in the shadows, and a thick, oppressive silence that pressed in once the sun dipped behind the fir trees. Wendy's first warning was the utter isolation. No light, but a flickering bulb, no phone reception, and a battered truck parked between her and the road. Her room, she realized, had a lock not just on the inside but on the outside as well. Miller's tone shifted quickly after the door latched. What began as promises of a safe bed and honest work mutated into veiled threats and explicit reminders of her isolation. He forced her to turn over her few belongings, locking her shoes and coat in an adjoining room for safekeeping. Dinner was plain and cold, but laced with a sharp metallic aftertaste Wendy recognized as the haze of prescription sedatives. She staggered to her mattress, eyes blurring, the barn's rafter shadows spinning above her head. Through the distorted fog of drugged sleep, Wendy awoke, wrists raw and aching. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, a strip of rough tape tugged at her mouth. Panic rose, but instinct kept her movements small. Miller's muffled laughter echoed from another room, intermixed with the low murmur of his brother bragging about cleaning up after strays. In the following hours, memory comes in fits and flashes. Rough hands, the smell of bleach, the shuddering squeal of hogs in a nearby pen. Wendy's world narrowed to a thin, blinking slit of consciousness. A darkness filled with the relentless drone of Miller's boots pacing the concrete floor, and the tear-filled warmth of her own breath trapped behind adhesive tape. Whether by luck or the inexperience of her captors, one of the zip ties was not fully cinched. Wendy wriggled and twisted until she worked the plastic loose, skin burning but mind sharpening through adrenaline. She timed her movements to the noise of a nearby radio, working the tape free from her lips with her teeth until only fragments clung stubbornly beneath her chin. When she heard Miller's snores, deep and unguarded, echoing down the corridor, Wendy made her move. In stocking feet she slipped to the side exit, barely evading a creaking floorboard. The barn door was chained but not padlocked. Her fingers clumsy but persistent, she manipulated the chain open, stifling whimpers as cold air bit her lungs. She was free for the moment, but the vast, empty farmland was another prison. Nothing but fields, silent outbuildings, and a long mile of darkness to the nearest patch of civilization. Every footstep felt magnified, every breath a risk. Wendy fled the property, alternately jogging and weaving through tall grasses and ditches, the sharp winter wind searing her cheeks and bare arms. Her body trembled from the after-effects of the drugs, her mind jumping between panic and a frantic urge to survive. Behind her she imagined searchlights, barking dogs, Miller's boots thundering over the open ground, but the night remained frozen and silent. Eventually the distant glow of headlights emerged from behind a stand of evergreens, a beat-up Chevy pickup bouncing down the county highway. She stumbled into the road, waving both arms, nearly collapsing as the truck screeched to a hesitant stop. The driver, a middle-aged farmhand on his way home from the late shift, took one look at her, disheveled, blood crusted around her wrists, barefoot and shivering, and knew something was wrong. Wendy sobbed out a plea for help as he fumbled his phone, dialing authorities before pulling her into the cab and blasting the heater. At the local hospital, the nurses treated Wendy's cuts and chemical burns, murmuring amongst themselves as she recounted her story in broken, trembling sentences. Police officers, some sympathetic, others noticeably skeptical, arrived soon after. In those early, shell-shocked moments, Wendy struggled to piece together timelines or even recall Miller's exact address. Her memory looped through the horror, sometimes inventing gaps or rearranging events as trauma bent the ordinary rules of recollection. In the days that followed, Wendy's story collided with the cold calculus of the justice system. Hospital records proved she'd been injured and drugged, but Miller's apparent charm and careful cover-up muddy every step. Her criminal record as a sex worker and her visible addiction scars were raised again and again as evidence of unreliability by Miller's lawyer. The police, wary of pursuing a difficult case with little physical evidence and a marginalized victim, filed an assault charge. Miller posted bail within hours, returning to his farm and closing his doors a little tighter. The system that should have sheltered Wendy labeled her unstable, providing little follow-up, no protection, and no path to lasting justice. Haunted by close calls and estranged from family, Wendy drifted to a new shelter in a neighboring city. Her attempt at justice ended as a footnote in Miller's file, and a warning told in whispers within the homeless community. Don't go near the Miller place, not if you want to make it out alive. Occasionally she saw Miller's name in the local crime blotter, always dropped quickly, never drawing attention. The trauma from those hours, and the bitter knowledge that her escape led to neither justice nor protection, would shadow every night she spent alone for years after. Wendy's ordeal was repeated, in some form or another, by dozens of women who later passed through Miller's orbit, except that for most, the chain never broke. They simply disappeared. What made Wendy's story different was neither luck nor strength alone, but a mix of desperation, timing, and the smallest sliver of human error left by her captor. A zip tie not tightened, a barn door left unbolted. Years later, her testimony became a turning point in the larger investigation. When the Marion County Task Force finally raided the Miller property, officers sought out Wendy's statement, this time cataloging the details that earlier law enforcement had dismissed. The distinctive pattern of chemical burns, the description of makeshift restraints, and her account of the intensely isolated barn all matched precisely with the evidence found on the scene and the stories of other missing women whose fates were, by then, heartbreakingly sealed. Wendy's rare escape, recounted in hushed voices in police precincts and shelter corridors, remains a stark reminder. The thin line between a survivor and a statistic often comes down to circumstances the world calls inexplicable. Her suffering never made the headlines. She was not the victim the system wanted, nor was her story the one the press rushed to print. Yet, for those who listened, her warning proved exact. If everyone had paid attention then, how many other women might have slipped the noose? How many might have told their own stories of escape, instead of vanishing into the oblivion beneath Miller's farm? Prolonged investigation, insufficient justice, and the public opinion wave. The aftermath of the Miller Farm revelations launched Marion County, and much of Oregon, into the kind of scrutiny and social reckoning rarely seen in rural America. From the moment the first bodies and physical evidence were recovered, a sprawling, multi-year investigation unfurled, demanding an extraordinary outlay of resources, expertise, and emotional stamina from all involved. What followed was both a procedural marathon and a study in the heartbreaking limits of even the most determined pursuit of justice. From the outset it was apparent this would be no ordinary criminal case. The investigation itself became a behemoth. Hundreds of officers, outside forensic experts, cold case specialists, and even FBI liaison teams were brought in, forming a task force that dwarfed anything Marion County had seen. The sheer volume of evidence, thousands of items from the Miller property, hundreds of witness statements, and well over 1,000 DNA samples, required state-of-the-art organization and technology. Warehouses filled with archived evidence, boards traced with timelines and red string, and digital databases overflowing with cross-referenced names modeled the chaos and scale. Months blurred into years. Officers worked grueling shifts combing through every scrap of evidence. Cold case detectives re-examined decades-old files on missing and murdered women, looking for patterns and connections that district attorneys had missed or ignored. Hundreds of tips streamed in from across the state, many of them driven by the non-stop media coverage and true crime fervor now attached to the name Miller. Yet countless leads turned out to be dead ends or honest mistakes, their investigation time-consuming but fruitless. What disappointed both the public and many law enforcement officers, however, was just how much evidence began and ended at the threshold of suspicion. While the physical artifacts and DNA at Miller's property created a tapestry of horror, actually tying Miller to each disappearance required painstaking verification. Some items dated back more than a decade. Victims had changed appearances, names, and sometimes left no dental or medical records to confirm a match. In several heartbreaking cases, remains were too far gone for conclusive identification. Forensics teams faced mounting frustration, and translators, victim advocates, and even genealogists were called in to chase down every possible clue to an identity. The trial process further amplified the emotional roller coaster. Prosecutors, knowing the eyes of the nation were watching, compiled mountain after mountain of circumstantial evidence, bringing expert witnesses and trauma specialists to paint as complete a picture as possible. But defense lawyers picked apart procedural missteps, arguments over search warrants, or the reliability of witnesses from marginalized backgrounds. Survivors and victim family members were forced to recount trauma repeatedly in adversarial cross-examinations, often emerging from the courtroom more shattered than vindicated. At the heart of public outrage was the inescapable sense that many victims might have been saved had complaints and warnings been taken seriously years earlier. National media outlets dug through police records and community interviews, revealing a disturbing number of red flags overlooked or consciously deprioritized, ignored reports from homeless advocates, missed connections in missing persons databases, and perhaps most damning, repeated calls from survivors like Wendy that were dismissed for lack of credible evidence. As the case dragged on, public protests swept through Marion County and beyond. Candlelight vigils for the lost women became a common sight, and social justice organizations held rallies demanding improvements to policing and funding for social safety nets. Op-eds swelled with anger. Some blamed local authorities for a culture of disbelief toward the poor and addicted. Others aimed higher, targeting state and federal legislators for systemic underfunding and chronic indifference. The pain and shame felt by the community found its voice in new advocacy coalitions, many led by survivors themselves. These groups hosted teach-ins at local schools, pressured city councils, and used social media to name not only Miller but every official or bystander who had traded attention for comfort. The phrase "invisible victims" became a rallying cry, scrawled across signs and repeated in televised interviews as a bitter indictment of the silence and complicity that had let evil fester so long. Benefits emerged from the tragedy, but never without cost. The investigation and ensuing trial forced long overdue reforms. Missing persons cases from the region were fast-tracked and prioritized for review. Community police partnerships were funded to open communication between officers and shelters. Databases were modernized to better track transient women and high-risk adults. Yet even these changes reopened wounds for families stung by institutional failures, grappling publicly with the fact that it took so many deaths for meaningful change to begin. Meanwhile, the media circus circled. True crime podcasts, investigative news specials, and best-selling books cropped up, some earning praise for shining a light on the dispossessed, others accused of voyeurism and profiting from pain. The survivors who consented to interviews did so at great emotional risk, sometimes finding acceptance but more often reliving trauma with little resolution. The families of the missing were besieged by reporters and internet sleuths alike, their grief made public property. In courtrooms and city halls, hard questions echoed. Who had failed these women? How could small communities ensure their most vulnerable were never again so easily ignored? And what did justice truly mean for those whose loved ones would never be found, or whose names faded in the shadows of the headlines? Perhaps most telling was the way the Miller investigation and its revelations cast a cold, unblinking light on the American mythos of small-town innocence. The tragedy showed with brutal clarity that the failings of individuals and institutions did not emerge from big-city anonymity but thrived just as easily under the cover of tight-knit rural life. Whispers once quickly dismissed as gossip or slander were, in hindsight, calls for help from those forbidden by class or addiction from being heard. For the authorities, justice felt both cathartic and incomplete. Miller's conviction was a symbolic win, but many detectives found themselves haunted by the sheer scale of preventable loss. Some retired early, unable to stomach more cold cases. Others committed to ongoing advocacy, working with nonprofits to ensure their hard-won experience would at least lay a foundation for the future. Law enforcement agencies throughout Oregon implemented new training sessions on victim sensitivity, trauma response, and the long-term consequences of institutional blindness. Yet the scars in Marion County ran deep. To this day, memorials dot county roads, and each anniversary brings new waves of grief and protest. Even as reforms take root, the community is forced to admit that no amount of compensation, conviction, or policy will ever restore the lost years and broken families. Ending the painful social lesson. The conclusion of the Miller case unfolded with a solemn gravity that resonated through every corridor of Marion County and indeed across the nation. This was not the ending sought by the families of victims nor the broader community, yet it was one that forced an unflinching confrontation with the realities that had made such tragedy possible. After months of testimony, forensic unraveling, and an emotionally charged public trial, Lester Miller was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and a slew of related felonies. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA matches, recorded testimonies, the arsenal and women's belongings unearthed on his property, and, perhaps most damning, his own quietly chilling confessions. The jury returned its verdict, a sentence of life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom, usually a place of echoing proceedings and hurried legal jargon, fell into a rare, heavy silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of all those lost voices pressed down from the walls themselves. But closure, such as it was, proved elusive. For the families who had waited years, some decades, for word of missing daughters, sisters, mothers, or friends, there was no neat resolution. Some learned the fate of their loved ones only through fragmentary remains and faded possessions. Others were left with absence and questions that would never be answered. The heartbreak turned for many into a tireless drive for accountability. Multiple civil suits were filed not only against Miller, but also against county and state law enforcement, whose failures had, in the eyes of many, enabled the prolonged nightmare. News reports shifted in tone after the sentencing, from sensational coverage of the Salem slaughterhouse to sobering examinations of systemic failures. Networks replayed interviews with advocates who, for years, had warned of the dangers lurking in the rural hinterlands, only to be ignored. Editorials questioned the entrenched practices of dismissing reports from women on the margins, whether because of poverty, addiction, racial bias, or prior run-ins with the law. There was a sense in both public discourse and legal action that Miller's brutality could not be disentangled from the wider tapestry of neglect and societal denial that had for so long protected predators and abandoned the vulnerable. The aftermath saw a multi-pronged wave of change, painfully slow, but real. Marion County law enforcement underwent sweeping reforms. Officers were required to attend trauma-informed training. New task forces were established for high-risk missing persons. The long-neglected partnership between police and community advocates was revived, aiming to ensure that future Wendys wouldn't be written off as unreliable or undeserving of protection. On a broader scale, Oregon's legislature enacted measures aimed at preventing such tragedies from recurring. Funding for women's shelters, addiction treatment, and mobile outreach increased considerably. Data sharing across agencies, previously encumbered by bureaucratic inertia and distrust, now became an urgent priority. There was a growing consensus that no one, regardless of their history or station, should fear vanishing without a trace. And yet many of these advances came wrapped within the bitter knowledge that they were too late for so many already lost. The faces of Miller's victims became symbols not just of individual tragedy, but of the warning signs willfully ignored year after year. Annual memorials grew in scope and solemnity, with crowds gathering at makeshift shrines and the edges of Miller's farm now marked by a community-funded monument etched with the names, where known, of the women whose lives were cut short. Amid the collective mourning, survivors and bereaved families emerged as advocates and, sometimes, accidental leaders. They gave testimony before legislative panels, spoke at schools and churches, founded support networks, and organized grassroots campaigns. The phrase, "never again," was transmuted into both a call to remembrance and to vigilance. Still, for every story that made the news, there were others that would remain hidden in police archives or passed over in hurried statements from agencies under fire. The ghosts of the case lingered on rural bus routes, in the faces lining the walls of women's shelters, in the silence after lost calls to 911. The Miller case also altered the cultural landscape with unsettling permanence. For law enforcement, it dispelled any lingering myth that small-town America was immune to evil, or that danger wore the scars of urban blight alone. New hires were briefed not just on the details of the crimes, but on the failures that had allowed them to happen, taught to recognize the red flags of predation and the special risks facing women in poverty, people dealing with mental illness, and those pushed to society's edges. For ordinary residents, the age of comforting denial had ended. Parents taught their children to be more suspicious of offers made in the name of charity or community. Newcomers to the region heard cautionary tales, and even those who bristled at the loss of innocence grudgingly acknowledged that to ignore warning signs was to participate, however passively, in cycles of harm. The case became a cautionary tale invoked at town hall meetings, overheard at gas station counters, and referenced quietly whenever another person disappeared without a trace. The legacy of the tragedy extended far beyond the local. Media outlets across the nation weighed in, drawing parallels between Marion County and other rural regions where poverty and social alienation had created similar conditions for predation to thrive. Sociologists cited the case in studies of institutional failure and the effects of economic marginalization. Nonprofits launched national campaigns and hotlines, aiming to connect at-risk women with resources and early intervention before they became invisible. Yet, there remained an undercurrent of frustration and fear that the lessons might fade as headlines shifted and memories dulled. Advocates continued to press for sustained funding, greater accountability, and new vigilance, not only from police, but from every citizen who might one day sense something wrong, something off, in their own neighborhood. When the dust finally settled, and Miller, now aged, stripped of any rural respectability he once held, was locked away, some called it justice served. But in private, conversations revealed the deeper truth, that closure in such a case is an illusion. The real test lies in whether the community sustains the resolve to see, respond, and defend its most vulnerable members going forward. Justice, in the Miller affair, was less a verdict or punishment, and more a communal reckoning. A painful but essential promise to honor the memory of the lost by ensuring society's eyes never again look away. The haunting shadow of the Miller crimes, once kept at the edge of memory, now stands at the center of Marion County's ongoing struggle. It is a reminder written not only on plaques or memorial stones but in every new policy adopted, every police report reviewed for bias, every hotline answered by someone who believes the caller. Only with this commitment, painful and vigilant, does the hope of true change endure, transforming one county's tragedy into a lesson for the nation, with scars that demand not only remembrance but collective action.